if you're specific enough in some of the story details, people react and they adapt it to themselves. In other words, you hear a story about like Cinderella or Hamlet or whatever else, and part of you is going, I am like Hamlet in this way. I am not like Hamlet in this way. My father is not a ghost talking to me from a tower, right? I have no temptation to put on a play to kill my stepfather or whatever it is, right? But even in doing that, if it's specific enough with the details of some of the story you use, then people automatically say, that's not me. But if you shifted it in this way, it would be. And so they're already adapting some of those details, even without you saying, you need to think about how this applies to you. We naturally do that. We naturally hear stories and we place ourselves as the main character, or side characters, or say we are not that, in which case we're writing our own story.
Hey guys, welcome to another episode of the Frontier Talk podcast. I'm Raj Hegde, and in this podcast, we explore the intersection of identity, people, and technology. Now, storytelling is a key skill that is relevant to everyone, whether you're looking to sell a product, you're looking to raise funds for a new startup, or are just looking to get buy-in for your proposal from key decision makers. A compelling narrative goes a long way to help you achieve what you desire. Yet for some strange reason, the skill is somewhat taken for granted, and there are very few frameworks and narrative arcs out there on the internet today. My guest on the pod is someone who wears multiple hats, both literally and figuratively, and he has his background purely rooted in theology. He has had a stellar career to date in the identity and security space, and to me personally is one of the best public speakers going around the block. Here to help you become a world-class business communicator, please join me in welcoming Mike Kiser, the Director of Strategy and Standards at SailPoint. Mike, it's an honor to have you on the podcast.
Thanks for having me on, Raj. I think you're a little overhyping me, but I'll allow it for now. Thanks for the flattering intro.
The pleasure is all mine, Mike. I'd like to start off by demystifying the mystery behind your hat, so to say. Is it a Texas thing, or how did the hat come about to become such an integral part of your identity?
Sure. It's not that much of a mystery. Has nothing to do with Texas, believe it or not. Right. Even though I hail from Austin, Texas. I used to work at IBM, and when I was working at IBM, part of my job for 5 to 6 years was advising people on strategy, especially in a competitive security environment. And I did that for the entire division of IBM security, which meant I was the strategy competitive analysis guy for 6,000, 7,000 people or something like that.
Wow.
And so when I go to conferences to help people find me and be able to hunt me down amidst the sea of people, I would tell them, look, if you need advice, if you want to talk over coffee or a drink or strategize, come find me. I'm the Yahoo in the hat. And so it really kind of made it easier for people to, there's the guy in the hat. I can go talk to him about X, Y, and Z. They didn't have to remember my face. They could just remember I'm that Yahoo. And so once I started doing it, people just, it kind of stuck by accident. And so then if I didn't wear a hat, the first question is always, what's wrong? Where's your hat? Which is fine. So it just it fell into it really. I do like the US of the 1940s or the myth of, hat wearing and all of that, but it just kind of fell into it. So originally it was just part of a strategy to help communicate with people. And then it just became a thing. So who am I to not give the people what they want, I suppose, but.
That's a great story in there, right, Mike? I'm curious to now explore your storytelling approach within the context of your keynote at EIC last year, titled Identity is the New Blue. Now, I personally was in awe of that presentation because I found it fascinating how you connect the progression of the color blue with the state of identity as we know it today. To our audience, could you perhaps break down the presentation for us as to how it came about?
Sure. I am constantly just on the prowl, so to speak, looking for stories, looking for interesting tidbits. And once my day job became a lot more public speaking and communicating about identity and security over the years, it's just kind of a default approach wherever I'm reading newscasts or I'm listening to podcasts or having conversations with friends, some part of the back of my brain is constantly thinking, what's the analogy? How does this relate to something I want to communicate, whether it's security related or persuading friends about other things?
Right.
Part of my brain is constantly looking for that odd connection. And so I had heard about the color blue being the color of 2020.
Okay.
And then somewhere on some podcast or something, and I don't remember the original source, someone offhand said, yeah, blue wasn't really a color in the ancient world. And I was like, I had the first reaction I think a lot of people do, which is, what do you mean? Of course it was a color. The sky was always blue. The sea was blue. And so I went to, this is going to sound really low level and kind of nerdy, but with 3 children, we went to the public library in June of 2019, 2020, before everything hit. And so I checked out a bunch of books on the history of color and read way too much and found some reliable sources. And it turns out, this is a whole thing. And so once I had the narrative, I knew also that it was going to be super visual, which is really appealing, right? The more you can engage people in visuals or audio or really anything, helps quite a bit in the experience, especially if you're talking. It helps them break out of like, oh, this guy's doing a slide talk versus, oh, this guy's arguing for a concept. And so I did a bunch of research, and then my poor partner at home, she is a long form editor. And so what that means is I exploit her endlessly, because what I'll do is I will say, hey, have you heard about this idea? And talk about it over a month or two. And eventually my story gets better and better, in part because she's like, no, that's not interesting. No, this is not part of a narrative trajectory, that kind of a process. But eventually it had a tight enough story. But then when the pandemic hit, it was actually even easier because of the rapid transformation we all saw take place.
Absolutely.
Blue had an easy parallel there. And so, it was a lot of base research, and then just the idea sat there for a year and a half until I knew that I wanted to communicate a big idea about the rise and popularity of blue and how we wanted to make identity not just commonplace, but popular, attractive, equitable, and easy to use. All the things I talked about in my keynote. And then I had that blue story and other options, but the blue I think fit the best, that were able to be usable in service of that big idea, if that makes sense. So it's kind of a symbiotic process, right? There are things that I feel strongly about or passionate about, or people in the industry feel strongly about, right? Or needs to be communicated. And then I'm constantly thinking of tangential stories that engage listeners and shake them out of just default, someone holding forth, so to speak. So that's it's got a long process of refinement over months, in this case, a year and a half or so, I think. So
Right. I'd love to explore more about your choice of analogies. I personally believe that a thought-provoking presentation is one that seamlessly connects the right dots in the right order. And I'm more curious to learn more about your dot collection process, where it starts from. You mentioned that you visited the public library to get more research. You learned that blue wasn't a color in the first place through a friend of yours. So that initiated a spark. But let's explore 2 scenarios. Exhibit A would be, say, you finalize a story or a message that you'd like to communicate to your audience, and then you go around exploring abstract concepts that perhaps fit into that narrative. Or is it the other way around, wherein you just randomly go out there to collect concepts that you find interesting and you store them in this imaginary cupboard of yours, and then you say finalize a message that you'd like to deliver to your audience, and then you open this cupboard and then pick the right dot that fits the narrative? So which of the two approaches seems like a better fit?
Both and. In other words, I'm
Okay.
constantly looking for fascinating stories that interest me that are not common, right? Anything that's surprising or shocking or fascinating, and then that's kind of just stored somewhere, right?
Right.
So that's always kind of there. But then, it's not just storytelling for storytelling's sake, although that's lovely, after the conference or at night, or I love, people telling fascinating stories about themselves or about life. But after you have that repository of stories, then I drill down when I have a talk to give or I want to communicate something. I drill down on what I'll call a big idea. In other words, this is a one sentence, very simple statement of what I want the audience to believe or do or walk away with, right?
Okay.
So for example, the blue one would be identity is on the same trajectory as the color blue, and we need to make sure that it becomes popular. That's the whole talk in one simple sentence, right? And so then everything else I do has to fit into service of that big idea. And a lot of times this feels like death. So for example, in the blue story, there's this huge competition between the color red and the color blue, and it waged for years, and it's kind of fascinating. And there's aspects where, red took over for a bit, but then it doesn't really serve that big idea well enough to be included. So what a lot of it is making sure, what am I trying to communicate? What am I trying to communicate? What am I trying to communicate? And refining, saying, here are like 5 stories I could use. Which one of these looks the best initially?
Right.
And then playing with it and molding it to make sure it matches the outline of salient points I want to support my big idea from the identity perspective, right? So it's a little bit symbiotic, but the primary is that big idea that holds everything together. Now, there are times when I say, here's a big idea I want to communicate. Here are my repository of ideas, and none of them really seem to work. Then I'll go trolling for one. I'm not sure what, like identity needing to be easy to use, for instance. Well, now I'm going to go look for a story that's all about that core, right? Now, maybe my store of ideas don't work, but now every conversation back in my head, everything I listen to, I'm like, well, does this work? Does that work? That type of thing. It takes a while though. So it's kind of both and. There's a store, but there's also looking for things, but it all has to serve, whatever I'm trying to communicate. If people come and they say, that was a great story, I have no idea what his point was. Well, then I've wasted everybody's 15, 20 minutes, so at least I think.
That is true. And how do you stress test these ideas? I mean, of course, you have a wife. Your wife is a long form editor, no doubts. You're in a lucky space in that sense. But how do you know what you're trying to create makes sense? Because it's easy when you are a conformist and you tend to do a better variant of what everyone else is doing. But when you're trying to create something original, there's always the risk, well, more often than not, that it would go above the heads of many. So how do you bring that sanity, so to say, in this process?
Well, my friends suffer through a lot of me pitching them stories, to be honest.
Right.
Also thinking about, it's almost like a 3-part thing, right? The big idea, whatever story you're trying to tell, and who you're telling it to. Because the language and the way you pitch it changes quite a bit. So in other words, what I do a lot of times is I find someone who's not in identity and not in security, not in technology. And I say, hey, let me tell you a story. And if I can explain it in terms that they understand and they can get and they identify with, then I know I'm kind of onto something. And the more I do it, the more it gets tighter and tighter. And I realize this is essential and this is not essential. And I just spent 6 minutes talking about this side topic that just confused the crap out of everybody, which is also common because I talk a lot, as you can tell. So I actually, and in doing it, one of the things I still originally heard about it from actually Ian Glazer, who is now at Salesforce doing identity. But also in my master's degree, we had rhetoric training. And part of it is there's a long process for, having an idea, writing an outline. But one of the things I picked up from him and that was reinforced in grad school was writing out the story in full. Because what that actually does is it forces people to align their ideas in ways you don't when you speak orally. So if I told you a story about my childhood, it's going to come out one way. If I write it down, well, now I've made conscious decisions about what I've included and what I haven't included, and I can go back and edit that, which is really powerful. Now, when I give the actual talk, I don't use those notes because otherwise I'll start to sound like a robot repeating a text. But it's helpful for editing and refining that process. So once I'd say I pitch it to people and tell the story over a couple times, trying to find new people so they don't have to suffer through it. And then you should ask back when we were in the office before COVID, my cubicle mates, oh man, they just got so tired of particular topics, which is fine.
There was like a particular hour called Mike's Storytime Hour where you'd be exposed to a bunch of wonderful stories. I mean, I'd love to be in a position where I could hear interesting stories because, everywhere I see is that there's a lot of sameness that is going around. I don't know. I just believe for some reason people haven't been forced to, in a sense, form their own worldview or form a point of view. And they just tend to believe what is being said or what is out there rather because it's the easy thing to do, right? And I think there has to be a forcing function for someone to basically get on that path to explore things that are not being said before, to understand the world from their own lens. And I think, public speaking in one sense, is a great forcing function for you to go out there and do that. But is there anything that could stimulate individuals to just go out there and improve their knowledge on a wide range of things that perhaps interest them?
Well, I think it's both and, right? Yeah, to directly respond to your question. Yeah. I mean, finding people who aren't like you, listening to podcasts you disagree with, reading news sources or books that make you, or movies, whatever else, right? The more input you get, the more you have to work with. I would also say though, that everybody has something that, makes them come alive. And you can see this when you talk to people. I had a friend who was going to give a talk at a conference once, and he was stuck on ideas and he knew what he wanted to talk about, but he didn't know how to frame it or how to make it more interesting to people. And I said, what are you doing this weekend? He said, well, I'm going kayaking. And I knew this guy went kayaking like every couple of weeks. And so once I asked a couple questions, he lit up like a fire or a light bulb. And he went on for like 10 minutes he went through this gate and then he did a roll and he's teaching these people how to do stuff and the river's crazy. And I was like, this is your topic. And so I think a lot of people, you don't necessarily need amazing stories. I think a lot of people already have amazing stories or have amazing things I don't know anything about kayaking. And so hearing him talk about it, I wanted to go kayaking. And I was like, this is amazing. And so I think people can find their personality and bring it into what they're saying and their experience. That I think a lot of people are like, oh, well, no one's interested in that. Well, actually, they probably are. If you're excited about it, that definitely comes through. So I think it's both and, right? It's diversity of inputs, but also realizing that you have everybody has something that they're jazzed about, and leaning into that it's a really easy way to tap into having these dynamic stories that can translate into communicating truth about identity or security or really anything you want to convince people of.
Absolutely. I think exciting things can simply be invoked if you involve. And I think many people involve in their passions and interests. And I'm sure they have a story hidden deep down. It's just so Mike, in your EIC keynote, you talked about prophets and popularizers. Prophets being the ones who blaze a trail, and the popularizers are the ones who basically get a story or a means to the masses. Could you perhaps double click on this and highlight the role of storytelling within each context?
Sure. It's fascinating because people tend to be, I think, especially in our industry, are more attached to or give more acclaim to prophets. In other words, people who are the voice crying out in the wilderness saying, this is happening. We need to go here. We need to do these 5 things. And, for a prophet kind of character, storytelling, is making people make a break with what they thought before, and probably in a large way, right? It's stirring people up, being very passionate about something, regardless of the reaction you get. And that's also difficult, right? Because you can feel when you're telling a story or you're giving a talk or when you're talking to someone about something and they're reacting or they're not reacting. And I think it's an odd irony there because I think prophets are highly regarded, but people tend to ignore them. Most prophets aren't listened to in their lifetime, in their I would say in their time of influence, right? It's like, 20 years ago, someone said that and wow, she was right. It's that kind of a vibe. Most of them, don't have massive success. The popularizers are much less oddly popular a lot of times, right? But what they do is they make it really easy for people to adopt new ways of thinking or to adopt something that's right there. They just haven't thought about using it in a particular way. So it's not so much, I don't think, in storytelling and popularizers, I don't think it's so much forcing people to change directions, to turn 180 degrees from where they were going or how they were thinking. It's more of a look how showing the value or showing an easy path to adoption. So I think in that sense, I would expect popularizers both of them would be thinking about their audience, right? Prophets would be confronting their audiences more often or trying to shock their audiences maybe. Whereas popularizers,
right,
I would argue, are trying to make them go, oh, I hadn't thought about that, but I already agree with premise A. And so if that leads to premise B, then it's kind of almost opening the door and welcoming them into a house as opposed to walking around and hitting them with a bat or something, trying to get them to think of something. That's 2 different vibes, right? And different audience awareness. But both I think could use storytelling or those concepts for sure.
Right. Let's dive deep into the process of storytelling per se. But before that, Simon Sinek always tells us to start any conversation with why. So could you perhaps let all of us know why is storytelling relevant to anyone? So why should anyone care about storytelling and what's in it for them?
Yeah. Well, if you've read a book, you've listened to any podcast recently, someone somewhere has said 1,500 times that we're designed for story. All right. So that's kind of a beaten down meme at this point, but it's true. You think about how people are motivated, why movies are popular, why stories are popular. Like it basically gives you a way to connect with people and move them. And it gives them space to think, space to maneuver around the framework you've built. You're saying, look, I want you to think this, or go and change and be like this. If I'm really didactic and prescriptive and I say, Raj, you need to subscribe to your local newspaper and support print journalism, and if you don't, you're a bad person. Well, that's great. But if I say, look, newspapers have always been informative. They've been this rock basis of news dissemination, and look how they changed this culture, or look how they advocated for justice in this environment. I'm engaging you on a totally different level, right? And you may still disagree, but there's room for you to negotiate, or for you to maneuver around that and say, and it's engaging on a different level, right? You're not going to listen to me if I come in and just tell you what to do. But if I engage with you and tell you a story, especially if I can throw you off from what your normal assumptions are, and shift the way you're thinking about it, then there's space to do that. And storytelling also, if you're specific enough in some of the story details, people react and they adapt it to themselves. In other words, you hear a story about like Cinderella or Hamlet or whatever else, and part of you is going, I am like Hamlet in this way. I am not like Hamlet in this way. My father is not a ghost talking to me from a tower, right? I have no temptation to put on a play to kill my stepfather, or whatever it is, right? But even in doing that, if it's specific enough with the details of some of the story you use, then people automatically say, that's not me. But if you shifted it in this way, it would be. And so they're already adapting some of those details, even without you saying, you need to think about how this applies to you. We naturally do that. We naturally hear stories and we place ourselves as the main character or side characters, or say we are not that, in which case we're writing our own story. So it's an easy vehicle that lets people think and adapt it to themselves without having to be quite as heavy-handed. And I think especially I would argue, and not to get too philosophical, but I think that society and culture and humanity is moving from something that's more didactic to something it's a little bit more amorphous. Story's always been there. I think people are a little more this next generation that's coming up and is already here is more oriented to story than some that have been before. We've always been oriented to story. I think there's a little bit more, there are gray areas that story can be used to explore rather than cut and dry. This is how things have to be. It's got a meandering answer there.
And is that a good... No, it is perfect. I mean, this podcast is all about meandering. That's where that's the beauty of oral communication, right? It's you can actually get the insights of, different concepts in a wide range of contexts. But to the point you raised about the current generation being more open to storytelling, is that a good thing or a bad thing in the sense that, we had an episode with Talk Searles earlier on this podcast, and he mentioned that most people listen for the purpose of dismissing. So I believe that a story in some sense could help alleviate that fear because it makes things more interesting to hear.
Doc is right in the sense that I like a lot of people, I like being right? Deep down, the selfish person in me is like, well, I want to critique what the other person is saying and find the holes in it and challenge it if I disagree with it. I think story, just like it gives people room to maneuver, it gives the storyteller themselves room to maneuver as well, right? And I think that stories provide a way to shift your perspective that may not exist otherwise. In other words, if I told you a story, the one I used from the Identity is Blue thing, where, a little girl in red takes a pot of white butter to her grandmother's one dressed like her grandmother, dressed in black, right?
Yeah.
You can hear that story and be sympathetic to the wolf, be anti-wolf, be dairy free. I mean, there are a lot of different angles depending on who you are and what time in your life you're at.
Yeah.
That when I was a kid, I was definitely the little girl in red because I was a kid, right? As I get older, I find myself identifying with the other characters in the story. Now that may not be a change in how I think about it completely, but it definitely it lets me shift, what I think about it and what I think the story is about. Right. I retell weekly. I retell stories orally with a group. And in retelling them, I've told some of the same stories over and over and over and over again. And what's really fascinating is I have told some of these stories like 5 or 6 times around a fire or at work or whatever else. And each time I tell it, I know it, right? I know it. I memorize it because I have genetically good memory. But every time I tell it, I learn from other people who bring these new perspectives, or even just me telling it, I hear something different because I'm different. The story's the same, but the environment's different. The people are different. I'm different. And so every time things shift a little bit. And so it's fascinating how meaning and purpose can evolve over the years as a result.
Right. That's a great answer. More so on the frameworks per se, how do you craft a compelling narrative? Do you perhaps have a framework for us in terms of how you go about creating your story?
Good question. Kurt Vonnegut diagrams the plots of narratives. If you haven't seen it, go on YouTube, watch. There's a 5-10 minute clip. There's like 3 or 4 different versions of it. They're really fascinating. There are not that many different narrative arcs for stories. You may have heard of the hero's journey or these kinds of things. There's 2 or 3 of them. One is like person falls in a well, where it starts out happy, it gets really sad, and then gets happy back at the end. Just like that, there's also common narrative arcs that you can use in speaking. Right now, the simplest ones are really straightforward, and you can recognize these when you watch movies or hear people talk. Easiest one I can think of is problem, solution, application. Right? You'll hear speakers say, look, here's this disastrous thing, like, say, space junk, and the low Earth orbit is full of it, and we're all going to just suffer as a result. Okay, well, then what's the solution? Well, here's how we should solve that. And then application would be, okay, and here's your part to play. Right? So you can do that structure. And once you have that structure, whether it's good, bad, good, or whatever the narrative arc is, then you can make that story fit, right? That's part of that looking for what the story is fitting the big idea that I have. Problem, solution, application is probably the most straightforward, but it doesn't always have to be like that, right? The ones that I've done most recently have just been this like climb to popularity. I did a talk on Sting's Every Breath You Take, which, started out with a demo tape and then wound up being the most played song of all time. Blue started out from just not existing to being the most popular color of 2020. But I would say also what you want to look for too, or what I look for, is a steady narrative and then a slight twist. So for example, the blue thing, it was, didn't exist. Then it became popular in the Middle Ages. And then it became commonplace. But along the way, one of the things I said that I love to say was that if you say blue is your favorite color, you have said nothing. You've basically said, I'm normal. You revealed nothing about yourself. So those kind of fascinating turns or twists are helpful. Like in the blue talk, I wound up not even talking about blue. I wound up talking about a product made with blue, which was blue jeans being super common and attributes about that. With the Sting and the Police, Every Breath You Take, I talked about, demo tape and constructing the song and playing with norms, but then them performing it live to make it really popular. And I played clips from that. And so what that meant was that change was inevitable. And so whatever system you're using, in this case it was machine learning, it would have to be able to deal with change. And so what's nice is to have this narrative where people think they know where you're going, and then a slight twist. Not that you're undermining what you've already said, but that, because, if you're giving a 20, 25-minute talk, about 15 minutes in, the most important parts are the first minute, the last minute, and then there's a dead spot somewhere 2/3 in that if you could start to lose people. And so it's helpful to have, it's not necessary, but that's in the back of my head. But as a general rule, side note, if you nail the first, minute and a half and keep people at the beginning and close really strong, they're going to think you had a great talk, even if you fell off the stage at minute 15, really. Because that's what they're going to remember. So anyway.
That's such an interesting narrative to explore, Mike. This reminds me of the time when I was looking to build a narrative around Frontier Talk. And I take great pride in the fact that it is the only podcast on the topic going around. So I banked on the uniqueness factor. But given the narrative arcs that you just mentioned, I'm really hooked by the David and Goliath arc, but with a twist. So I think it would be an interesting thought experiment to say, build a narrative around Frontier Talk right away with this arc. So if I were to take a shot, it would go something along the lines of, once upon a time, there was a little podcast called Frontier Talk that explored this unique concept called decentralized identity. It was going all right up until this gentleman by the name of Mike Kiser happened to show up on the pod. And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, the episode got so viral because of the value that it brought to audiences that it beat all the other podcasts out there. So in turn, through one incident, this little David eventually went on to become a Goliath. How does that work? Is that all right?
Yeah. I mean, it just depends on what, I guess the part there though is what are you trying to make me take away? That Frontier is great? Right? So that was a story, but I would say start with, lose me, because that's not a great idea to use me as the base of the story. Just kidding. But figure out what that big idea is. Your big idea is probably, Frontier is an amazing, innovative podcast, or grew in its short life. It became an amazing thing. And so then, if that's the case, find something that similarly has that quick trajectory, or a movie or a TV show that's really popular. Look at, any of the Disney products, for instance. The Star Wars stuff is fairly popular. But yeah, there are ideas there. But I'm not so sure that this episode is really going to set the world on fire.
And no, it's all about being optimistic in life, and no matter what, Frontier Talk will always be the number one podcast in my eyes.
There you go.
We always number one. But it's all about at times coming into reality and just actually trying to build a compelling narrative. But that was a great thought experiment. Coming back to storytelling, what in your opinion are the traits required to be a good storyteller, and how do you build on these skills?
Knowing stories. Being excited about the story you're telling, being able to adapt your language to wherever you are, right? Knowing who you're talking to and finding the back references to make that's in their background or in their experience. So shifting it to match your audience's needs. I think that if you're a really good storyteller, you do things. There's content and then there's delivery. Content, is that editing and pre-work and paring down to the bare bones of what the narrative is and making sure you hit those really hard. And then delivery is a separate issue, right? Are you on stage someplace talking to 1,000 people? It's going to be a different vibe than if you're having drinks with 3 people, right? And so your language shifts, your cadence switches. I have a friend who I've heard talk a bunch, and I love this guy because he uses pauses incredibly well. And he does stuff like that where you're like, this is amazing. Because the pauses, if I were doing it, I would feel like it was like 4 minutes. I wasn't saying anything. But he uses the dead space so well, and it gives people space to think and space to process. I just love hearing him talk because he's just so relaxed about it. So I think it's more than anything else, it's matching your own style as well. Is your personality to be professorial? Lean into that. Is your personality to be informal and make attempts at humor? That's great too. It just depends on what your personal personality is like, and matching that maybe.
Right. And I'm curious to know what makes a good pause, in the sense that, are you better off taking a pause earlier on in your presentation because that's when perhaps the audience is most attentive, or does it take place in the middle? Is there like a strategic position where you take a pause?
I would say it's a lot like, this is going to sound really overwrought. It's a lot like a TV show or a film. That's the easiest way. If you are giving if you're giving a talk or telling a story that needs to be polished to a high degree, or you spend a lot of effort on it, then I would suggest thinking about it like a script, where is the high of your talk? Where is the low point? Basically you're diagramming out the emotion of a scene. Do the same thing with your talk. And you can actually block out things with how you tell stories, especially if you have a space to work with. So for example, the pausing, it's going to be after important things, after things you want people to think about, in between points or in between sections, or really anytime you want to just let something sit, right? And you can do that with blocking as well to make it super powerful. In other words, if something is in the past, little things, it needs to be to your right. In most left to right societies, it needs to be to your right. So it starts over here and ends over here. And along with that pausing, what you can do is you can land someplace on stage, you're walking or you're moving, and then you stop, and then you say what you want them to hear, and then you just pause for a bit. So there are techniques there that blend in, but I think the core of it is mapping out that story and figuring out where you need to yell or have emotion or to vary your speech. Because if I talk like this the entire time, which I have a tendency to do sometimes, then no one's going to listen to me because I'm just droning at that point, right? But if I say, Raj, you need to listen to these 5 things, and then I talk quietly, that can get really old too. So, you have to balance it out, right? No one wants to listen to someone yell at them for 15 minutes.
So this is something you can stress test in regular conversations, and then that eventually plays out in a public setting when you are, say, to give a speech on a forum, for that matter. I mean, that's really cool advice. I mean, my takeaway from this is to perhaps use pauses in the absence of provocative statements, because provocative statements get that response from the audience. But if you're speaking something that is known to everyone and everyone is okay with what's going on, but then you can add some drama by just taking a 10 to 15 second pause. Right.
Perfect. And it'll feel weird. But and get feedback from people. If they say, we thought you were looking for a knife to attack the crowd, well, maybe don't do it like that. So it just depends on what the reaction is. So
and how important is cultural context when it comes to reading a room? What should you be aware of when you're trying out or experimenting such stuff in multiple contexts?
Yeah, on the ID Pro Slack forums, we've been having discussions about this actually. Some
Okay.
Victoria and I and some other people talking about where you should always have your audience in mind, right?
Right.
And like when you're in different places, if you can, uh, you should switch like measurement systems. That's an easy one, right? Like, so if I'm talking in Europe, I'll switch to metric where I possibly can, which took some years of training, but also cultural things, right? If I'm in Spain, I'm not going to talk about American baseball. I'm just
Right.
not, unless it's to mock it or do something else that is self-referential to myself, right? I mean, it's my personal
Mm-hmm.
story that happens to involve baseball, but I'm not going to say, did you see the game last night? Because no one has. You have to be really careful, I think, about bringing things up because a lot of times you don't know what the connection or what the affiliation is. So,
Mm-hmm.
in general, I try and stick to things that I know are popular or well thought of or will not cause a reaction, right? In fact,
Okay.
I tell the story about naval warfare and how it changed at the Battle of Trafalgar with Admiral
Mm-hmm.
Nelson. Back in my head, I'm always thinking about, okay, what does this sound like if you're British? What does it sound like if you're French or Spanish? Is there an issue there? Because it was those two fleets against each other, right? In
Right.
general, I don't think anyone's really upset
Too
about
fixated. Yeah.
naval warfare from 1805. But at the same time, it's helpful to think about, right?
Mm-hmm.
And even just vocabulary and language, I will change depending on who I'm talking to and what I think what they will respond to. Because my goal is to get out of the way for them to hear and buy into the big idea. And so everything serves that. If my language is too high or too low, if my stories distract from what I'm trying to say about the story, right?
Mm-hmm.
War stories, background history of different countries can be touchy on that, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or even political philosophy, right? If I'm someplace in particular states, United States, I'm going to switch my stories out and use something that I think is much more local. Um, so
Right.
it just depends. I think you can be oversensitive with that, um, but in general, I think it's something you definitely need to consider. Like I said, you're trying to get out of the way. You're trying to not even be a thing, right? I would rather
Right.
have them be taken with the idea and the story and buy into the idea than think, oh, Mike told that story. He's American. He's from Texas. Therefore, he
Mm-hmm.
thinks, why would he use that story? Or even Mike is a great speaker. I don't want them thinking that. I want them thinking about the story and thinking about the idea. I want to get out of the way as much as possible so that what they're interacting with is the idea, not me personally and my potential prejudice or background or anything else. So,
Right.
meandering way to answer that question, but
No,
um,
that was perfect. I mean, definitely serve some food for thought. But beyond, say, a public setting, a story is almost always built for an audience, be it your boss or your coworkers or a prospective investor in your startup. So, in these private contexts, how do you assess the needs in this case to align your narrative?
well, I think that's actually really, really similar, to be honest. The
Right.
production values are much lower, right? You're not having to create video or think of visuals per se.
Mm-hmm.
And you're not probably writing it out in full or anything like that, depending on who you're talking to. But you can still mine whatever set of stories you have
Right.
to use in those situations. Your language drops to being really informal, much more conversational, right? Because you
Okay.
sound like a moron. You're like, yes, thank you for coming today. And let me tell you, they're like, just get on with it, right?
True.
So at the same time, the more you hear, the more you learn, the more you think about how stories work, the
Mm-hmm.
bigger repository you have. And
Okay.
so I think what you'll find is you'll know if your stories are landing. Especially if you have background with these internal audiences, that helps quite a bit because now
Okay.
Meredith is really into knitting. And so you can think about what their proclivities are, what they like to do, what they're into, and weave that into your stories as well. I wouldn't say, hey, you like knitting, so let me tell you a story about knitting. Not like that. But you can build on past experience with them also, right? And so you're doing the same thing, you're just doing it on a micro level. Eventually this can work out really well or it can backfire. If you're too formal about it, people are like, oh, this has to do always with the story. And they can kind of shut off, right? So you have to be relaxed about it and it has to feel natural. And which if you're working on making it feel natural, it's already probably a bad sign. But
got it.
So
no doubts. And do you have any tips to perhaps dial up the curiosity of your audience? We spoke about the pause and coming up with, say, provocative statements. Any other ways to perhaps dial up curiosity?
I like to make people react. Just that's my personality. And so I'm always looking for the surprising angle or the story no one has heard about before.
Okay.
But yet it's common, right? So for example, blue didn't exist. Well, everyone's going to react to that on some level.
Yeah.
At the very least say, what are you talking about? If they say you're an idiot, I'm on board with that too, right? I don't really care as long as I've captured them.
Right?
Yeah. As long as I've forced them to listen for 5 more minutes, that's my goal, right? It doesn't always have to be dramatic like that. If you're talking to a smaller group, personal stories work a lot more powerfully than it would be talking to 1,000 people. Talking to 1,000 people, no one's going to care, or they probably shouldn't care about what you had for lunch last week, or whatever small story you're telling, unless it's momentous. But for a smaller audience, personal stories are, I felt this way, and that can draw people in as well, depending on who they are, because then they know you more and you're building that connection. I'm always about telling stories to communicate and convince people of ideas, but also to draw on shared experience, building community and building rapport with people. So people, if they're not naturally curious, it's going to be a lot more difficult, right? If you know what your audience believes, then you can, or is heavily bought into, you can either reinforce that or, contradict it gently to make them pay attention. I had a professor once in my theology program that would just say provocative statements all the time, which works sometimes. Other times it gets really old, you're like, okay.
I'm curious about life in general, and to our audience, trust me, all of the concepts that we're going to talk about from this point on tie in beautifully with the concept of storytelling. So this is interesting. I recently came across a concept called reality privilege from Mark Andreessen, which states that for the vast majority of humanity, their online world is immeasurably richer and more fulfilling than most of the physical and social environment around them. So my question to you is, how can one work towards a stimulating life that is rich, not monetarily, but more or less rich in terms of being substantial enough, and also filled with fascinating people to talk with, exchange ideas, and perhaps date?
That is wow. This took a turn. Let's just say it like that. Those are some.
You're looking for the twist. You're looking for the twist in the Frontier Talk podcast. Welcome. I was waiting for this.
So you're asking
putting your learning
how to
practice,
have an exciting life? Is that kind of the
more or less so? I mean, it's more about how do you move away from the default. That's why I said work towards. You get my point? It's how do you work towards that sort of.
That's a huge question. I would say
food for thought.
Yeah, if I had to answer it, I think it's constantly getting out of whatever comfort zone you find yourself in. So, you're in some situation that you know and you're used to.
Yeah.
going someplace where you are disempowered, where you are learning and forced to learn, broadens you out, I would say. So what I find myself repeatedly doing actually is finding the next subculture that I'm not a part of and learning about it. Now I'm the youngest child in my family, and so I'm used to just not knowing stuff. So on one level, that's kind of natural. But I think that kind of displacement that forces you to grow and learn cultivates an attitude of wanting to learn and develop and experience things you haven't done before. It could be online also, to be honest. I think it's, see, come back at me here, Raj. I mean, it could be online. Usually, I think it's probably richer if it's not. Now, depending on who you are and where you are, you may not have a choice, right? It's fascinating because I saw a report recently that people are starting to live, especially in the States, live in areas that are politically affiliated with what you already believe, which on one hand makes some kind of sense. On the other hand, is a recipe for non-growth,
disaster,
right?
Yeah,
disaster and non-growth on a personal level. If I'm not surrounded,
and reinforcing your beliefs, right? Non-growing, exactly.
Right. Yeah. I'm not saying you have to abandon whatever you're convicted of or believe in, but if you're not interacting with people who believe differently than you, you're not changing as a person. You're not growing as a person, even if it's marshaling and understanding your own philosophy or point of view in order to communicate it more appropriately. So, yeah. So, I mean, I think that applies across everything, across, what you do, who you hang out with, who you potentially date, or what friends you keep, right? That's hard to do, though. That's hard to do. And a lot of times it can be exhausting. I'm in multiple friend groups where I am the outlier. And I didn't do it on purpose. It just happened. And so partly it's my personality just to argue against whatever the group is deciding. So that's probably not, that's not healthy, but that's a different podcast. But yeah, expanding yourself out and stretching you. So that's a lot of that's travel. It could be displacement in terms of where you live. It could be a lot of different things, So I don't know if that fundamentally makes you a more, gives you a more stimulating life, but it seems like it would.
Speaking about living a simulating life, I personally believe that one of the prerequisites for doing so is to be interesting. So, Mike, how does one become an interesting person?
Wow, that is a big question. I don't know. Is the ultimate answer.
Okay.
Other than just be interested in things.
Right.
I mean, full stop, right? Be curious, be open to new experiences, and be interested in other people. People have stories to tell, people have experiences, and learning from them is such an opportunity, I think. And
Absolutely.
So drawing people out, I love, like I said before, I love doing that, like talking to someone for 5-10 minutes and trying to figure out where their heart is, what makes them light up. That's just super fun.
Awesome, Mike. Thank you for sharing your insights. Right. It's now time for my favorite part of the podcast. It's the Frontier Fire Round, where I put my guests on the spot by asking them a series of rapid fire questions. So, Mike, are you ready for the challenge?
Sure. I hope, maybe. Why not?
Nah, you'll do well. No worries. Let's get started. So the first question is, if you could only teach 2 words to everyone, what would they be?
2 words.
2 words.
I shouldn't think about this too much, should I? It was rapid fire.
On the go.
More, please.
Right. Okay, that's beautiful.
I don't even know what that means.
No, that's perfect. I mean, you could use it in so many contexts. But anyways, what never fails to make you laugh?
What never fails to make me laugh? Most anything, to be honest. I think there's humor in everything. And so I mean, except maybe funerals, but even then, I mean, there's something there. But yeah, I would say just I can find humor in anything, just about.
Perfect. If you could have one subject to learn for the rest of your life, what subject would that be?
History.
And why is that? Just to double dive on it.
It's I think it's just full of stories, right? I get to learn about everything.
Right.
Any subject is fair game in that
Absolutely.
case. Whereas if I take, like physics,
Mm-hmm.
I'm probably more word oriented than math oriented at this point.
Right.
So
That's
right.
perfect.
Unless I'm trying to escape a planet or something, that's a different scenario.
We got Elon Musk for that, so it's all good. I think we can focus on the words for now. It's all good. What's your mantra in life, Mike?
Wow, I don't think I have one.
Really?
Should I make one?
You're a man of
I don't.
words. Yeah.
I don't.
Impossible
no,
is nothing. Go get it. Impatient with
Oh.
action, patient with results.
No, see, I'm not. No, yeah, I don't. Okay, no, I don't have a mantra, and like, it feels. Yeah, I don't know. I don't think I have one actually. Sorry.
Let's make one for you. Be interesting, I guess.
Be interesting or be interested, maybe. That sounds a lot like an Apple.
I would say interesting lies. I mean, you can't be interesting if you're not interested, right? So I think that links in beautifully. But anyways, we're just philosophizing at this point in time.
Yes.
Amazing. And finally, Mike, what's your advice to anyone listening to this podcast?
Listen more. No. Anyone listening to this podcast, just listen to stories. They're all around you, and tell your own story. Find it and tell it.
On that note, Mike, it was an absolute delight to have you on the podcast today. Some of the points you raised around storytelling will go a long way in helping our audience build a compelling narrative to gain more traction for their offering. I thank you for your time and wish you the best of luck in all of your endeavors going forward. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me, Raj.
That was Mike Kiser. Mike will be delivering a keynote at the European Identity and Cloud Conference, EIC, and that is something that you definitely should not miss. I personally am looking forward to his keynote, and I think you should too. Get your tickets via the link in the description box below. I hope you enjoyed this conversation that explored pretty much every facet of storytelling, and I hope it's given you the toolkit to go out there and build a story to help you achieve your desired outcome. If this podcast is of value to you, please go on and hit that like button and share this with anyone who might find this information useful. Now, as always, feedback is a gift that keeps on giving, so we'd love to hear what you think about our episode, and if you have your very own frameworks that you'd like to share, please share them in the comment section down below. Until next time, this is me, Raj Hegde, and I hope to see you all again on this stimulating journey to redefine the I in identity. Stay safe.